Postmodernism is one of the most fascinating philosophical topics of our time. Unfortunately, it is also one of the most confusing. Postmodernity has many different interpretations, and pseudo-intellectuals like Jordan Peterson, who conflates postmodernism with Marxism, aren't helping. But we can break down postmodernism into two primary categories: postmodern philosophers like Foucault and Derrida, and the postmodern condition, a particular historical situation. In this video, we'll be looking into the postmodern condition, focusing on its interpretation by Jean-François Lyotard, Frederick Jameson, and Jean Baudrillard, starting with Lyotard. Lyotard was the first to use the postmodern condition to describe our current historical moment in his 1979 book of the same name. In the introduction, he describes postmodernism as skepticism towards meta-narratives. That is to say, a skepticism towards grand narratives that devour all other narratives. Common examples being religion, which sees everything as the will of God, or Marxism, which sees all of history as a class struggle. Particularly important for Lyotard is the meta-narrative of progress and objective truth, held in high regard by many modernist thinkers, and as we'll see, it's something that he will question. But as Lyotard himself states, understanding postmodernity as a skepticism towards grand narratives is a vast oversimplification, so let's delve a little deeper. He presents postmodernity as a specific cultural reflection of the post-industrial age that emerged after the Second World War, when our ability to produce exceeded people's need for products. Particularly, he emphasizes the computerization, or in our terms, the digitalization of society. Lyotard observed nearly half a decade ago that knowledge was becoming not an end in itself as the Enlightenment ideals were, but a product to be produced and consumed. YouTube is a good example of this, as informational content like this video is made to be consumed, blurring the lines between information and entertainment. Furthermore, he points out that the commercialization of information brings with it new challenges, such as who has access to information, who controls the flows of information, and similar issues. 4 decades later, Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff made similar remarks in a book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Addressing how big tech companies gather information about their users, she raises the question of who has access to that information, who decides and controls the access to that information, and who decides who decides. The first issue concerns the distribution of information. The second concerns authority over that distribution. And the third concerns who has the power to determine that authority. At the moment, all of these things are in the hands of private actors, with the state acting primarily as a consumer, something Lyotard predicted. And as he writes, the ruling class is and will continue to be the class of decision-makers. Even now, it is no longer composed of traditional political class, but of composite layers of corporate leaders. And as Lyotard also points out, people act on the information available to them. As such, knowledge and power are, more than ever, two sides of the same coin, meaning that control over information will serve as a powerful source of power. Zuboff is similarly concerned with big tech's control over information and the unprecedented power resulting from this control. She also looks into how big tech uses their control over information to steer people's behavior. Check out my video about big tech surveillance if you want to learn more about Zuboff and her investigations into big tech. For now, let's investigate another crucial element of the postmodern condition as discussed by Lyotard, this time concerning the legitimacy of scientific knowledge. He raises the issue that scientific discovery is increasingly dependent on technology, meaning that scientists are also increasingly dependent on receiving funds. And as money becomes an increasing necessity, those who invest in research also want that same research to yield some kind of benefit. They want their investment to be profitable. The result is that the profit motive steers which lines of inquiry are to be pursued and which are not. Let's look at a few examples from the field of psychiatry, as they are particularly poignant. In 1971, Lauren Mosher, the head of schizophrenia research at the National Institute of Mental Health, started the Soteria project, which would treat schizophrenic patients without drugs. Mosher believed that psychosis arises from emotional and psychological trauma, and that a psychotic episode was the mind trying to work through that trauma. He hypothesized that if we provide psychotic patients with a safe environment surrounded by compassionate people who wouldn't be frightened by the patient's erratic behavior, these patients could recover without the need for medication. If Mosher was right, he would pose a threat to the pharmaceutical industry. Because if healing from mental disorders could occur without drugs, then a major source of profit would diminish. As such, when Mosher requested a $700,000 research grant over 2 years, he was only granted $150,000, less than a quarter of his request. In spite of these financial limitations, Mosher's project proved fruitful. Many of his patients were faring better than the patients who received standard care involving drugs. When he began reporting these results, the funding for the project was withdrawn entirely, and he was pushed away from his position at the National Institute of Mental Health. Similarly, when David Healy, a leading historian of psychiatry, began investigating whether antidepressants would increase the risk of suicide, and found that they did, the University of Toronto retracted their job offer, and a prominent figure in psychiatry warned Healy that if he kept reporting his findings, his career would be destroyed. When Nadine Lambert found a correlation between children treated with Ritalin, a medication for ADHD, and increased smoking and cocaine use among young adults, the National Institute on Drug Abuse stopped funding her work. Here it is worth noting the amount of money involved in psychiatric medication. As of the year 2010, the sales of antipsychotics and antidepressants reached $24.2 billion, and the sales of psychiatric drugs in general went over $40 billion in 2008, with 1 in 8 Americans taking psychiatric drugs on a regular basis. Not only that, but psychiatry is the medical profession that receives the most amount of money from drug companies. The anecdotes and information from psychiatry in this video comes from Robert Whittaker's Anatomy of an Epidemic, a book that exposes the dark truth about psychiatry. If you want me to make a separate video about it, let me know in the comments, but for now, let's return to Lyotard. We see that he was correct about the impact of the computerization of society, and also that he was right about the way economic interests impact science. As such, we must be skeptical toward any grand narrative of truth brought about by a consensus through discourse, because such narratives are held in place not by some divine force, but by powerful economic interests. Jameson tackles the postmodern condition in a radically different way from Lyotard. Lyotard wrote the postmodern condition as a report on knowledge, but Jameson approaches it as a particular cultural analysis. He looks at a variety of factors such as art, architecture, film, and much more, to try to understand our current historical situation. First of all, he challenges any notion of the postmodern society as a break from previous forms of society. Instead, he argues that it is a continuation of capitalism, a purer form of capitalism where even culture itself has become a commodity. This new era of capitalist commodification is accompanied by a flatness or depthlessness of all things. Jameson illustrates this point by comparing Andy Warhol's diamond dust shoes and Vincent van Gogh's pair of boots. He goes through a series of interpretations of the latter painting, imagining peasants working hard in the field among the fruit trees, breaking their backs trying to make a living from agriculture in a poor rural village. But when it comes to Warhol's diamond dust shoes, Jameson writes that they are nothing but a collection of dead objects. They tell no story beyond their surface appearance. He points out that they represent the commodity fetishism so prevalent in our time, but without any critical element to them. To the extent it can be considered critical, its criticism is itself a commodity. Based on this, Jameson doubts whether art even can assume a critical role in postmodern society, believing instead that art is doomed to commodified superficiality. He continues his examination of Warhol's work by looking at the famous pictures of Marilyn Monroe, commenting on how stars become commodified and transformed into their own images. Jameson goes on to characterize the excessive commodification of every aspect of our culture as pastiche, a word that means parody without irony or humor. Good examples of pastiche today might be Marvel's Thor: Love and Thunder or the series She-Hulk. She-Hulk being the most easily illustrated example. The show could have been a critical parody of certain aspects of modern feminism, but it lacks the necessary irony to be even remotely critical or funny. As such, it comes off as being in bad taste, devoid of any humor whatsoever. In a word, it comes off as pastiche. This describes the state in which Jameson sees all of culture, and, according to him, it comes from how, in late capitalism, reproduction is far more dominant than production. This means that there is very little innovation in our current time. Rather, there are reproductions infected with a pernicious sameness. Superhero movies are, again, good examples. Rather than being original and innovative, each superhero movie feels almost identical to the next. This is why filmmakers like Martin Scorsese critiques them, and he is right in his critique. In addition, Jameson addresses the particular nature of politics in our postmodern society, observing that overtly political ideas like universal healthcare become a source of cultural conflict, whereas overtly cultural issues become sources of political dispute. Furthermore, Jameson argues that in the commodification process of postmodernism, the past is utilized as a commodity feature. Think of Stranger Things or a number of other shows who utilize the 80s aesthetic to invoke a sense of nostalgia. However, the references to the past do not need to be true or accurate. It only needs to be allusions to an often idealized but sometimes unspecified past. Take for example the slogan, "Make America Great Again." Exactly when America was supposed to have been great is never specified by the people that use this slogan. Instead, the past is used as a glossy image, an idealized, unspecified point in history. Jameson calls this historicism, which seemed to mean using history as a feature of the present, in contrast with history, which places our present moment in the wider context of the past. He believes that we have to return to the meta-narrative of Marxism to regain history in our political struggle. This is particularly important to Jameson in context of how he believes our subjectivity have been impacted by postmodernity. To Jameson, late capitalism has fragmented and divided us into different aspects of our postmodern lives. When we are in school, we are students. When we are working, we are workers. In our leisure time, we are consumers. The two former have existed at least since the Industrial Revolution. the difference being that when you returned from work, you regained your sense of self as a human being. But today we perform the social role of the consumer, even when we are alone. There is no space for you to just be yourself. You are always already something else. Jameson believes that if we rally around Marxism, we can retake and reunify our subjectivity. This puts him in direct conflict with Lyotard, who remains skeptical to grand narratives, and even writes that a self doesn't amount to much, commenting on how we are already fragmented from the moment we are born, by the social roles that are projected onto us without our consent. This is just one of the several conflicts between the two readings of postmodernity, but for now, we'll move on to the third and final reading of the postmodern condition. Baudrillard's reading of the postmodern condition is the most distinct of the ones featured in this video, and it is perhaps also the most cynical and pessimistic. His perspective is drawn particularly from analysis of the media and the forces of production. From these analyses, he argues that we live in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, where the apocalypse itself has passed us by. The nature of this wasteland, which he calls the desert of the real, is that the very distinctions between reality and the simulated have disappeared. To fully grasp this, let's take a step back and look more broadly at what led him to this conclusion. We'll start with his earliest work, The System of Objects, where Baudrillard constructs the theory that commodities gain their value, not from their usefulness or even how much people are willing to spend on them, but from their relation to other commodities in a system of objects. His point is easily illustrated by an anecdote about black pearls from psychologist Dan Ariely's book Predictably Irrational. In 1973, Salvador Asiel, also known as the Pearl King, went into business with a young Frenchman called Jean-Claude Brulé, and together they introduced black pearls into the world market. But the pearls didn't sell. No one wanted gunmetal grey pearls hanging around their necks. But Asiel was a clever man. Though I doubt he had read Baudrillard, he had picked up on some of the same tendencies Baudrillard was analyzing around the same time. So Asiel waited till everyone had forgotten about the black pearls, and then he arranged for them to be featured in magazines, surrounded by the finest diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. Suddenly the black pearls, which had been rejected by the traditional market, were selling at a great speed and outrageous prices, not because anything about them had changed, but because Asiel had positioned them favorably in the system of objects. In this system, things lose their inherent meaning and become liquid, floating, transparent, and hollow. All value becomes relative, and there is no inherent worth to anything anymore. It is merely a system of signs. In Symbolic Exchange and Death, Baudrillard takes his analysis further and provides a historical context for the system of signs, which he calls the 3 stages of simulacra. The first stage is the counterfeit, which he says goes from the Renaissance to the Industrial Revolution. Here, the value of the counterfeit is evaluated by how close it is to the original. How closely does the painting resemble its motive? How close is a copy to the original? The second order simulacra is that of production. Here, there is no distinction between original and copy, because in the industry of mass production, everything is the same. Each and every product are copies of one another. Lastly, there is a third order simulacra, which has no relationship with any real. It is dominated by copies without originals, where the medium itself, as McLuhan once said, is the message. Now we're approaching Baudrillard's very complicated media analysis, but I'll do my best at explaining it. Firstly, Baudrillard addresses how the questions asked in an opinion poll sets the perimeter of what answers can be given, usually only allowing a yes or no. Secondly, he talks about how the opinion polls can influence the opinions they are supposed to measure. This is something the famous propagandist Edward Bernays also addresses. In addition, an experiment conducted in 2005 by neuroscientist Gregory Burns demonstrates that our perception of reality can be influenced by a group opinion, even without us being aware of it. As such, our opinions become copies of opinions polls, which are themselves copies of opinions, making our opinions copies of copies, or rather, making our opinions copies without originals. In other words, pure simulacra. Baudrillard broadens his analysis into all of media, for example, television. The things we see on TV have to correspond to the things we like, otherwise we wouldn't watch it. But, at the same time, what we like is influenced by what we see on television, making our likes and dislikes into pure simulacra. I have a very good little anecdote which illustrates exactly how the Baudrillardian simulacra works, and ironically, it comes from an HBO sitcom. Just to give you the necessary context, the sitcom takes place in the far future aboard a space cruise ship. One day, an accident causes the death of the chief engineer and also knocks the ship off course, so they won't be back on Earth for 5 years, meaning they'll all likely die of starvation. The second-in-command engineer rushes to find the captain and figure out what to do about the crisis, only to find out that the captain is an actor hired to give assurance to the passengers, and the real captain is actually the dead guy. Now, the engineer and the fake captain have to work together to resolve a number of crises, though they often only make things worse. Anyway, here's the anecdote. In Season 2, the people back on Earth have done the most human thing possible about this ongoing disaster. They've made a soap opera about it. And here is the best thing. That soap opera is being broadcasted onto the ship, so the passengers are watching a soap opera about their own lives. Naturally, in the soap opera, the captain is portrayed as handsome, competent, and, in other words, opposite of the truth. Now, at a certain point, the passengers learn that the captain is a hired actor and they revolt, which ends in an election where they're supposed to elect their new leader. Someone nominates the TV representation of the captain for the election, and when he wins, no one really knows what to do. Then, everyone turns to the real captain and realizes he could become his TV representation. So they pick him up, put him in a chair, and turns him into a simulation of his own simulation. A copy of his own copy. That is to say, a copy without an original. It would be inaccurate to say that the real captain is gone. After all, he is still there. Rather, it is the very distinction between the real captain and his representation that have disappeared. This is pure simulacrum. This is hyper-reality. Two other content creators, Olivia Sun and Plastic Pills, have both made videos about hyper-reality in the context of love. Olivia talked about it in context of rom-coms and sitcoms, where we imitate the depictions of romance, which are themselves imitations of romance, making our practice of romance into imitations of imitations, copies without originals. Plastic Pills goes even further in using Baudrillard to analyze The Bachelor, talking about how The Bachelor, an imitation of love under highly artificial circumstances, shapes our expectations for so-called true love, making our expectations hyper-real. Now, if I were to sum up Baudrillard's take on postmodernity and depiction of hyper-reality, I would compare it with the optical illusion of two mirrors placed opposite each other, each reflecting nothing except its own reflection, which is itself a reflection of itself. It is this optical illusion which causes us to become melancholic and nihilistic, as hyper-reality engulfs all of our lives. And it is this optical illusion that Baudrillard speaks of when he writes the following: "The universe, and all of us, have entered live into simulation. Thank you for watching this video. It was a beast to make, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe to my channel. Naturally, I was only able to scratch the surface on these topics, so as usual I'll leave you with a few recommendations. Unfortunately, there isn't much content on Jameson or Lyotard on YouTube, but there is a lot of content about Baudrillard. Obviously, there are Olivia Sun and Plastic Pills videos, whereof Plastic Pills have made several more videos on Baudrillard. Then and Now has also made a great video introduction to Baudrillard, and Jonas Cheka has 2 very good introductions on him. Furthermore, Rick Roderick's lectures are always among the best content on YouTube. Links to all of this are in the description, but on my part, this is all I have for you today. Take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye.